this guide to writing the American Constitution. The American Constitution is going to be very important to your study of American politics in Year 13, or whenever you've started it towards the end of Year 12, depending on how your school has organised the A-level politics course, either EdXL or AQA. If you are doing the American option, the first thing almost certainly you'll start with is a look at the American Constitution, how it was written and why it was written, and the circumstances under which it was written. The American Constitution is the handbook to the American political system, and it is curious in being so because America is the first country in the world to codify a constitution of this type, and it's become the model of constitutions for many other countries, certainly countries with written constitutions base them on the American style of constitution, often starting with "we the people." The structure of the American Constitution is a model and pattern for all subsequent constitutions. However, other constitutions have come and gone, but the American Constitution lasts and persists. It still describes the framework of the way the American political system works today. So one of the best ways of understanding American politics is to understand their Constitution. First of all, a brief history of the writing of the Constitution and the context in which it was written. Europeans began to arrive in America in the 1600s and settled along the East Coast, the British or English settling first in Jamestown in 1607. Settlers came to the United States for a variety of reasons. Adventurers, younger sons who weren't going to inherit the farm or the estate, people looking for gold, Puritans, or so-called Puritans, looking for religious freedom and escape from religious persecution in Europe. The Spanish settled in Florida, and the French settled in parts of Canada, while in the East Coast, Russians moved into Alaska. Now, each of these colonies were very different to European countries in the sense that they were spread out along a country with few roads, and most of the communication was along the coast. They developed quite independently, and they developed their own ways of working, their own internal constitutions. They also developed their own agricultural practices. And to this day, if you move north to south of the United States, you're likely to encounter a greater diversity of accent, and the southern and northern states of the United States quickly developed different forms of agriculture. The southern states adopting slavery, and whereas this practice of slavery wasn't so common in the northern states. 13 colonies by the middle of the 18th century, each with their own charter or permission to govern an area, each governed by a governor. But internally, their own democratic systems were developing a form of representation, and those representatives gathered together in 1774 at the First Continental Congress. The Continental Congress, or the gathering together of representatives from each of the 13 colonies, was in reaction to an increasing sense of injustice. Many of the colonists had begun to feel that they were, well, for a start, they weren't represented inside the English Parliament, and yet they were being taxed by the British government for the defence costs and for the naval costs and so on. From the British point of view, this seemed perfectly natural since the colonists were becoming, many of them, very wealthy. Ideas, though, in the United States were becoming prevalent, and ideas that were more advanced in many ways than the kind of political ideas that were in Britain. Writers such as Thomas Paine were travelling to the United States, and people were developing ideas that were common in France at the time, intellectual ideas of the Enlightenment and ideas of democracy and representation, and soon this seemed to coalesce in one slogan: no taxation without representation. In other words, they didn't like being taxed while they had no representation in the English Parliament.
If the stamp man tells you to kiss his ass, shall he get away with it and live? Don't let your courage cool, or a few bullies scare you. We've nothing to fear but slavery. Love your liberty and fight for it like men who know its value. Once lost, it will never, never be regained.
The government had imposed a number of taxes that were increasingly unpopular: taxes on tea, taxes on printing, and taxes on sugar in the 1764 Sugar Act, and it limited the colonies, or the colonists, from moving into the interior to avoid conflict with the French. All of these things seemed to be an imposition on their life from a country that was far away and which they had no democratic input. Tensions grew further and more taxes were imposed: taxes on glass, taxes on paper, taxes on paint. The tax on tea was particularly unpopular, and its tea seemed to represent something particularly British that the Americans themselves were going to reject. And in 1773, A group of Americans, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty and dressed in an American garb, roughly representing Native Americans, climbed on ships in Boston Harbor and smashed up crates of tea and threw the tea into the harbor, and that became known as the Boston Tea Party. It became a sort of symbolic act of protest, since tea was very valuable. And in 1776, the Continental Congress endorsed a statement of complaint against the Crown, against the government and against its impositions, called the Declaration of Independence. It opens with the very famous lines of, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." This stated both the philosophy of this new country, its aspirations, its desires, but also, the bulk of the document, was a list of complaints against King George III in particular, and what they saw as a kind of tyranny. The principle behind it was radical. It was the idea that people can choose their governments. Governments weren't derived from God or divine right, but came from the consent of the people. The American Revolutionary War that resulted, or the American Rebellion, or the American War of Independence, ended in 1783 with the defeat of the British at the Battle of Yorktown. It was an extraordinary victory and highly unpredictable. The Americans had defeated what was then the largest military power with the largest navy on earth. They'd done it mostly with the help of the French and by having some very good generals and the British having some very poor generals. How then to rule themselves? The first reaction of the American colonists was to maintain something like the system they already had, a loose confederation of colonies, now states, and these 13 states would pretty much rule themselves, cooperating over things that needed to be cooperated over. This would be very limited in a Continental Congress system called the Articles of Confederation. This would not have an executive government, would not have an executive president, and the Continental Congress would not be able to make laws that applied in the states. It also wouldn't be able to raise taxes. It was rather analogous to something like the European Union or the UN, a cross between a talking shop and a coordinating body. So the United States itself didn't come into existence until 1787, or at least in 1789, when they endorsed the Constitution. The intervening period between 1783 and the writing of the Constitution of the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. This period saw considerable difficulty for the Americans, and indeed the project of the United States, or the project rather of this independent 13 states, seemed to be teetering on failure. There was rebellion, most notably in Shays' Rebellion, a rebellion among indebted farmers who complained that they were being, again, unfairly treated by now a despotic government. They hadn't fought against the British to have a despotic government of landowners imposed upon them.
Oppressed by the very men whose property we fought for, whose independence we bled for. Yes, we owe money to these men, whose purses are their conscience, who hear their lust for wealth louder than the cries of the poor and the needy.
Whether the Constitution of 1787 is a brilliant compromise which allows an extraordinary balance between the desires of liberty and the necessities of government, or whether it's a counter-revolution in which the more radical libertarian principles of the war against the British are extinguished, is a matter for historical debate. During the period of the Articles of Confederation, inflation rose, states began to act as if they were independent countries, they put up tariffs against each other's goods, they even restricted the migration from one state to another. The American system was falling apart. It also was possibly falling into disorder. The Philadelphia Convention, which was called together to rewrite or reform the Articles of Confederation, started with a radical decision. They were going to start from a blank sheet and write a new constitution from scratch. The decision to effectively write a new constitution from ground zero was extremely controversial.
I smell a rat.
And they banned delegates from communicating with the progress of the convention. Outside the convention hall, rumours gathered that a counter-revolution, that a king was going to be imposed over their heads, and they were reassured by the convention being chaired by George Washington, probably the most loved and trusted man in the United States. However, they grappled with a series of problems, all of which may well have defeated them. First, how should they be represented? Some of the states had small populations. Some of the states had large populations. If they were to be represented in a new Congress by population, it would be dominated by the big states. If, on the other hand, states were to be represented equally, This would be clearly unfair to the big states and would disenfranchise those larger populations. Competing ideas of equal representation by state and representation by population were resolved in the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan, or the Connecticut Compromise, which saw the House of Representatives representing states by population and the Senate representing states equally, 2 senators per state. Other questions had to be resolved. How powerful would the president be? What limitations would be placed on their power? What should they do about slavery? Since the southern states' economies were highly dependent on slavery and northern states' slavery was rare. Of how the constitution should be amended. What would be the period of time for a president to be in power? How should elections be conducted, and how extensive should democracy be?
Problem will be the degree of authority which the federal government will have over the states. In the ancient governments, even where there wasn't some strong central authority, there was always some controlling power.
They compromised over the Constitution, and they compromised over representation, and they produced what they hoped would be a balance. At the end of the convention, Benjamin Franklin closed the convention by saying that really they'd come up with a constitution few of them would have designed at the beginning. It was almost to none of their liking, and therefore it might be to everybody's liking.
I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions even on important subjects which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise.
In other words, it was a compromise, and they'd done the best they could. It was governed by the overarching principles of limited government, checks and balances, and federalism. Federalism allowed the states to continue to exist on the basis of out of many one, or e pluribus unum, which is one of the national mottos of the United States to this day. States would maintain their independence underneath a federal government. In many ways, the American Constitution has been described as an experiment still unfolding before our eyes. Is it too early to tell whether it's worked? Possibly.
They asked me how I could be against the new Constitution when our friend General Washington will be the first president under it. That's fine, I say, but how about when General Sloshington, or who knows what scoundrel, becomes the second president?
Look at the Senate, being created by the new Constitution. 6 years, and they can be re-elected as long as they please. It's really an appointment for life. And they'll be in this new federal city, surrounded by walls of gold. Gold flowing in from all our pockets. And they'll live in this Eden with their fellow senators, far away from any knowledge of how ordinary people live.
Overall, if you recall, or if you remember, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and limited government, you understand the fundamentals of the American Constitution, which you will explore over the remainder of this course.